Welcome. Today we are taking a critical look at a tragedy that has really cast a long shadow over Australian legal and investigative history for over 2 decades now.
It really has.
We're talking about the 1997 murder of Jaidyn Leskie. And I mean, this is a story that is just defined by complexity, by controversy, and ultimately by this profound lack of resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into the source materials, the investigative notes, the legal arguments, all the analysis, we have to pause.
Of course.
Our deepest sympathies go out to Jaidyn, to his mother, Belinda Murphy, and to his entire family. The mission for us today is to move past the headlines and really try to understand the full scope of what happened in Newborough, Victoria.
And, maybe more importantly, why this case is still officially unsolved after so much scrutiny.
Exactly.
It is a profoundly difficult and frustrating set of facts. Jaidyn Raymond Leskie, born April 30, 1996, died sometime around June 15, 1997. And the sources, they paint a very clear picture of just immediate disaster for the investigation.
And when you look at the elements that were, stacked up against the investigators from the start, it's almost overwhelming.
It really is.
It wasn't just a simple missing child case. It was a perfect storm of complicating factors.
Absolutely. The list is long. First, you have the victim's age, a 1-year-old child. That means no immediate witnesses, no clear chain of events he could describe.
Right.
And then, even more devastatingly, there was that 6-month delay before his body was found.
6 months.
And that turns a desperate search into a protracted murder investigation that has to rely on degraded evidence.
And that delay, it just meant that all those vital, immediate forensic opportunities were just gone. It created this massive gap in the timeline that the prime suspect could really exploit.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Then you layer in the strange disruptive events at the scene of the disappearance.
The pig's head.
The incident with the severed pig's head and the vandalism, which, it immediately polluted the public narrative with these baseless rumors about cults.
Oh.
And finally, the investigation was just relentlessly bombarded with false tips, with pranks, with more baseless rumors. It sent police down countless dead ends.
So that whole atmosphere of confusion and misdirection, that's really central to why this ambiguity just persists to this day.
Absolutely central.
Okay, let's drill down into the crucial events of that night. We need to go back to the living situation and establish a precise timeline for Saturday, June 14th, 1997.
Agreed.
Because that timeline, it really forms the basis of the entire legal case.
It does. So Jaidyn lived in Mo with his mother, Belinda Murphy, and his older sister. His father, Brett Leskie, he was separated from Belinda and living out of state at the time.
And on the night of the disappearance, Jaidyn was in the care of his mother's boyfriend, Greg Domasevich. We'll refer to him as GD.
Yes, and he was at GD's home in Newborough, which is a neighboring town.
The sources indicate that this care arrangement had already gone wrong hours before the disappearance was even reported.
It had. GD was originally supposed to drop Jaidyn off at his regular babysitter at about 4 o'clock that afternoon.
But he didn't.
He failed to do this. Belinda Murphy, she tried to contact him but couldn't get a hold of him. So she proceeded with her plans to go out with her sister, basically assuming that GD would just continue to look after the child for the evening.
So GD is responsible for the child. And if we fast forward to those critical hours of early Sunday morning, June 15th, the sources detail a razor-thin timeline for GD's movements.
A timeline the prosecution later zeroed in on.
Yes.
At approximately 2:30 in the morning, GD left his home in Newborough. He drove about 20 minutes to Ryan's Hotel in Traralgon to pick up Murphy.
Who was, and the source materials are specific about this, very intoxicated.
Very intoxicated, yes.
So Jaidyn is left completely unattended during this, 40-minute round trip?
At least, yes. GD arrived back around 3 a.m. and dropped Murphy off at her home. Now, crucially at this point, Murphy believes Jaidyn is either sleeping safely at GD's house or
in a hospital.
Or, based on what GD had told her earlier, receiving medical care in a hospital. So she went home and went to sleep.
And she only realized her son was missing when GD came back to her house 2 hours later.
Roughly 2 hours later, yeah. Around 5 a.m. That's when he finally informs her, before taking her to the Mo police station.
This timeline, that 2-hour gap between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., and the 40-minute gap before that when Jaidyn was left alone, this is where the entire legal conflict lies.
Completely.
You have GD's account versus the police's contention.
And the narratives are just irreconcilable. GD's claim, which he maintained consistently, was that he left Jaidyn asleep on the couch to avoid waking him up.
While he went to pick up Murphy.
Correct. And that the child was abducted during that precise 40-minute window. He claims he returned and the child was just gone.
But the police theory argues the tragedy had occurred much, much earlier. It shifts the whole focus from abduction to concealment.
It does. The police contention was that Jaidyn had likely died hours earlier while under GD's care, potentially before 9 p.m. on Saturday night.
Hours earlier.
The police theorized that the actions GD took that evening, driving to Traralgon, making up these stories, they weren't part of an abduction recovery. They were the beginning of a deliberate, elaborate cover-up.
Designed to create distance from the actual time of death.
Exactly.
The investigative response was enormous, though. The sources make a point of comparing that initial 20-day search to the effort after Prime Minister Harold Holt's disappearance in 1967.
And that just illustrates the scale of the crisis. It was a massive, highly resource-intensive search. It involved every level of local and state police.
But it was unsuccessful.
Ultimately, yes. The lack of immediate witnesses, the sheer scope of the search area, and critically, that constant inflow of misinformation and false tips. It meant the search failed to locate the boy.
And that initial failure to find the body, it allowed GD's narrative of abduction to really dominate the early public conversation.
It did, even as the police were already focusing on him.
Let's turn to GD's behavior during that critical night, because his actions while he was picking up Murphy are so demonstrably deceptive.
They instantly raised red flags for the police.
Of course they would.
The deception began before he even got to the hotel. While Murphy was still at Ryan's hotel, GD called her.
Right.
And he told her that Jaidyn had been taken to the hospital for a minor burn.
A minor burn? I mean, it's such an unusual lie.
It is, but it served immediate purpose. It shifted Murphy's focus from where her son was to his temporary health status.
But then he escalated this deception after he picked her up. He fabricated a story that became really the cornerstone of police suspicion about his state of mind.
He did. While driving her home, he informed Murphy that he had moved Jaidyn from Moe Hospital, claiming the care was substandard, to the Maryvale Hospital near Morwell.
Okay, and the damning detail here.
The damning detail, which is confirmed by all the sources, is that Maryvale Hospital was undergoing construction at the time. It was definitively not accepting patients.
So it was a complete verifiable fantasy.
A total fantasy.
And a fantasy he used to control the situation, to make sure she wouldn't try to see the child.
Exactly. He refused her request to visit Jaidyn, repeatedly insisting she was too drunk and would be refused entry by hospital staff.
So this maneuver, it bought him critical time.
Critical time. Murphy returned home believing her son was safe, if temporarily hospitalized, and that allowed GD the freedom of movement for those crucial 2 hours until 5 a.m. when he finally reported the disappearance.
GD later tried to frame these elaborate lies, the burns, the hospital transfer, as just an ill-timed joke.
Right.
But the police, they certainly didn't buy that defense.
Not at all. For the police, these claims were concrete evidence of a premeditated cover-up.
They saw it as him trying to build a false timeline.
That's what they believed. That he was attempting to establish an entirely fictional parallel timeline to account for Jaidyn's absence, buying himself the time he needed to deal with the body and clean up the scene.
Okay, now let's go back to those 2 hours. From 3 a.m. to 5 a.m., the missing hours, between him dropping Murphy off and reporting the child missing. GD claims he was frantically searching for Jaidyn, alone, around Moe. He was assuming he'd been abducted as a prank.
And this is probably the weakest point in his entire narrative.
It seems that way.
He claims to have been searching for a 1-year-old child he believed had been kidnapped. Yet, around 4 a.m., in the middle of this supposed frantic search, he was stopped by police.
For a standard random breath test.
Just a routine stop.
And he said nothing about a missing child.
Nothing. He had a direct, sanctioned opportunity to notify law enforcement that a child was missing, and he chose to keep silent.
For the investigators, that must have been a huge red flag.
A massive one. That lack of immediate urgency strongly suggested to them that GD knew the child was not missing, that the child was, in fact, deceased, and that he was engaged in the logistics of concealment.
That failure to mention the child to the police at 4 a.m., it really speaks volumes about his intentions at that moment.
It's hard to explain away. He was attempting to maintain cover and avoid suspicion.
Which is completely inconsistent with the behavior of someone whose child charge has just been taken in a violent or dramatic abduction.
Entirely inconsistent.
We also have to address the monumental distraction that occurred at the same time, the vandalism incident.
Yes.
The sources confirm this immediately complicated the crime scene and distorted the public perception of what was going on.
It introduced a totally irrelevant yet incredibly sensational element into the investigation. So while GD was out picking up Murphy, his house was vandalized.
And we're talking about a severed pig's head left on his front lawn and several smashed windows.
Exactly. And this led to immediate, baseless public speculation, which was fueled by the sensationalist media about satanic cults and ritualistic abduction.
But the police, they quickly zeroed in on the reality of it, didn't they? They labeled the perpetrators the pig's head team.
They did. Police swiftly determined this was a specific, unrelated act of targeted revenge against GD.
All right.
It was orchestrated by the brother of his ex-girlfriend, Yvonne Penfold, allegedly in retaliation for GD's history of violent behavior toward her. The key here is that police ruled out any connection to Jaidyn's disappearance almost immediately. They saw it as just vandalism.
But the vandals were still critical witnesses. Did they provide any information about what was happening inside the house when they were there?
Their testimony was inadvertently crucial.
How so?
When questioned, the Pig's Head team stated specifically that during their time vandalizing the house, which was after 2:30 a.m., they did not hear any sounds of a child crying or making any noise at all.
Which directly contradicts GD's claim that Jaidyn was alive and sleeping there just minutes before.
Yeah, it does.
Despite the clear police findings, though, theories persisted that the vandals were somehow responsible for the abduction and death.
Oh, yes. And GD himself strongly pushed this narrative.
He did.
Aggressively. He claimed that the Penfold group had kidnapped Jaidyn for revenge, panicked once they had the child, and then killed him. These kidnapping theories were widespread in the public domain.
But we have to look at the verifiable evidence.
And there is zero verifiable evidence from the source material to support any of these third-party abduction theories.
And what about the forensics of the vandalism site? Did that tell us anything about the possibility of an intruder?
It did. Crime scene examiners testified very clearly that the broken section of the window was just too small for any intruder to gain access.
Okay.
Furthermore, the glass around the breakage was undisturbed. That suggested a localized impact vandalism, not the kind of forced entry you'd need for a break-in and abduction.
So the investigative conclusion was firm. The vandalism was a red herring.
A massive red herring, but a red herring nonetheless.
Let's shift now to January 1st, 1998, 6 months after Jaidyn vanished. The discovery of his body, that transformed the case from a missing person inquiry into a confirmed murder investigation.
With physical evidence, yes, though that evidence was already compromised by time.
The discovery was made by picnickers at Blue Rock Dam, which is about 18 kilometers north of Mo.
And the circumstances of that discovery, they really speak to a deliberate, calculated effort to conceal the body.
How was the body found?
Jaidyn's body was wrapped in a sleeping bag and deliberately weighed down by a 2-meter crowbar.
A crowbar?
Which strongly suggests an intentional disposal into the water to ensure the body remains submerged and hidden.
But the cold water had preserved it to some extent.
It had provided some preservation, which was vital after such a long time missing.
What did the forensic pathology reveal about the child's injuries, the potential cause of death?
The autopsy revealed several critical details. The primary injury was severe head trauma, which is believed to be the cause of death.
Okay.
Jaidyn also had a broken arm that forensic examination indicated had been poorly bandaged.
And there was the presence of a specific, very unusual drug detected in his system.
That is perhaps one of the most suspicious forensic details. The drug, benzhexol, was found in Jaidyn's system.
Benzhexol, what is that?
It's an anti-Parkinson's medication. It's often used to treat muscle spasms, but it can also be used to counteract the severe side effects of certain antipsychotic medications.
Why is that critical in the case of a 1-year-old child?
Well, its presence is profoundly suspicious. A 1-year-old would only have benzhexol in their system if it was administered by an adult who had access to it.
Right.
The evidence strongly suggested the child had been poisoned or medicated shortly before his death. While the sources don't explicitly state who had access to the drug, its presence pointed the investigation directly toward the adult caregivers.
Specifically GD.
Specifically GD. And it formed this dark layer of suspicion regarding the circumstances immediately preceding that fatal head injury.
So along with the benzhexol and the crowbar, what other items were recovered near the body?
Near the body, alongside the crowbar and sleeping bag, investigators recovered a pair of baby's boots, a bottle, and a bib. These items, particularly the crowbar, were key pieces of circumstantial evidence linking the disposal back to the caregiver.
The discovery of the body, however, led to what the sources call a catastrophic forensic failure.
the issue of DNA contamination.
This is truly a tragic investigative error that fundamentally compromised the case.
It is. Jaidyn's clothing was sent for DNA testing, but at the laboratory, cross-contamination occurred.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
It means the test results were rendered unreliable, creating, as the sources say, further confusion in the evidence presented to the court.
And the sources state the Leskie case is now internationally recognized as an example of forensic failure. That's a huge claim.
It is, because it highlights the fallibility of DNA testing in criminological research when the chain of custody or lab protocols are breached.
So any trace evidence that might have definitively placed a perpetrator at the scene.
Or excluded an innocent party.
Mm.
All of it was rendered useless due to this single critical mistake.
And without that clear, definitive biological evidence, the prosecution was left with, just a circumstantial argument.
That's all they had.
And as often happens in high-profile cases, this lack of clarity led to rampant speculation.
Yes.
Including claims that Jaidyn was kept alive for months after being kidnapped.
Yes, and that was fueled partially by GD's mother. These theories suggested that, based on the body's condition, Jaidyn had been abducted and cared for, only dying much closer to the discovery date.
And they cited things like supposed healing in the broken arm or changes in teeth and size.
They did, but the scientific community thoroughly refuted this.
Okay, so can you give us a sense of how forensic experts explain that refutation? How did they make it accessible?
Certainly. The experts explained that the claims about bone healing were simply unfounded. Further analysis found no verifiable evidence of it.
Okay.
More broadly, the environment of Blue Rock, Dama, cold aquatic environment, it plays tricks on the body. This field, it's known as aquatic taphonomy, and it explains that the cold water can preserve some tissues while causing others to undergo changes.
Changes that just look like growth.
That can superficially resemble growth or developmental changes, particularly in teeth and hair, or even the perception of minor structural changes in bones due to physical degradation.
So these changes could easily be mistaken by a lay observer for signs of continued life or development.
Easily. But scientifically, they were completely consistent with normal decomposition in that specific environment over that period of time.
So all forensic analysis pointed to death having occurred near the time of disappearance in June 1997.
Exactly. Despite the contamination issue and the public speculation, the timeline established by the police remained robust based on the scientific refutation of those survival theories and the established date of the head trauma.
Given that timeline and the benzhexol, the police had established a strong circumstantial case against GD long before the body was even found.
They did. On July 16, 1997, just 1 month after the disappearance, GD was arrested and charged with murder.
5 months before the body was located.
Correct. The entire prosecution was built on the circumstantial evidence they had gathered up to that point.
What was the specific theory the police took to the prosecutor?
The police theorized that Jaidyn died during that initial 6-hour non-contact period, likely before Murphy even left for the hotel.
And they alleged that GD, having caused the death, then set about disposing of the body.
Likely walking it into the dam during those crucial missing hours between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m.
What material evidence supported that disposal theory at the time of the arrest?
The searches of GD's home turned up items that were consistent with having been submerged in water, which was highly unusual. Specifically, his wallet and some money were found wet and concealed under a mattress.
Okay.
Additionally, investigators recovered tissues stained with a small amount of Jaidyn's blood in GD's household rubbish.
Which suggests both a cleanup effort and direct contact with a water environment.
Exactly.
GD's reaction to the charges was one of aggressive denial, which became central to his public persona during the trial.
His denial was immediate and hostile. He rejected the charges outright, accusing the police of harassment and using inflammatory language in the media. He referred to his accusers as dogs.
So that really set the stage for a highly charged trial.
It did. The defense immediately pushed back against the state's reliance on suspicion rather than concrete proof.
The trial in 1998, despite all the evidence of deception and the disposal theory, it resulted in a stunning acquittal.
GD was found not guilty on December 18, 1998. The prosecution just failed to meet the burden of proof required for a murder conviction, beyond a reasonable doubt.
And for the defense, led by prominent counsel, their strategy was obviously very effective.
Highly effective. They leveraged every single weakness in the prosecution's circumstantial chain.
What were the key pillars of the defense's strategy that led to that reasonable doubt?
Well, they had 3 main targets. First, They systematically attacked the credibility and the relevance of the circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
They argued the wet wallet and the bloody tissues were insufficient proof of murder. Second, they successfully weaponized the forensic failures, specifically that DNA contamination issue. They convinced the jury that if the state's own experts couldn't handle crucial evidence, how could they trust any of the remaining testimony?
So the prosecution's star witness, the DNA, was effectively removed from the table by a lab error.
Precisely. And third, the defense used the pig's head team incident, not as evidence of an abduction, but as a distraction.
How?
They argued the possibility that someone else was at the house, thereby casting doubt on GD's exclusive opportunity to cause harm. They argued that the totality of the circumstances suggested a series of unfortunate accidents or coincidences, not premeditated murder by GD.
However, during the trial, some of the most disturbing revelations concerned GD's prior treatment of the child, didn't they?
They did. It painted a very grim picture of his character.
What kind of testimony came out?
Multiple witnesses testified to GD's volatile behavior toward Jaidyn in the months preceding his death. This included witnesses reporting that GD had hit Jaidyn across the face, that he'd aggressively pushed him, and that he regularly locked the one-year-old child in dark rooms whenever GD was annoyed or felt his parenting time was being interrupted.
So this testimony painted a clear picture of frustration and potential aggression.
It did, though it failed to prove he was the one who inflicted the fatal blow.
Despite the acquittal, the desire for accountability obviously didn't fade, and this led to intense pressure for the 2006 coronial inquest.
The inquest was controversial. GD's legal team dismissed it as a media-driven exercise, but it was a pivotal moment for the case.
Right.
The state coroner delivered a finding that, while constrained by law, was the closest the state came to any official resolution.
What was the exact finding of the coroner?
The coroner found, and I'm quoting here, that Greg Domazovich had contributed to the toddler's death and had likely disposed of the boy's body.
That sounds extremely strong, yet it still wasn't enough to secure a criminal outcome.
Because the coroner stopped short of finding GD solely responsible for Jaidyn's death, citing the lack of definitive evidence that could stand up in a new criminal court.
And a coronial inquest, its purpose isn't to impose criminal guilt?
Exactly. It aims to determine the cause of death, the identity of the deceased, and any contributing factors. That subtle but critical distinction meant the legal system was still bound by the prior acquittal.
This inability to act on such a strong finding led to calls for significant legal reform, specifically targeting double jeopardy laws.
That is correct. For listeners who may not be familiar, double jeopardy is a legal principle that says a person cannot be tried for the same crime twice after they have been acquitted.
And Jaidyn's mother, Belinda Murphy, she joined a coalition pushing for Victoria to reform these laws.
She did, arguing that the coroner's explicit findings constituted new and compelling evidence that should override the protection of the prior acquittal and allow for a retrial.
Has GD ever publicly moved away from his aggressive denial of murder?
The closest he has ever come to an admission of fault was in statements he made to journalists years later. He acknowledged, "It's upsetting still, because ultimately there's a kid that died because of my stupidity."
Referring specifically to his decision to leave the one-year-old home alone.
Yes, but he still maintains that the fatal head trauma was not his doing and that he remains innocent of the murder charge.
So despite the inquest, the legal status remains unchanged. No new suspects, no plans for a new trial.
That's right.
Shifting our focus now, the narrative around this case was so heavily shaped by the national media. Veteran crime journalist Kerry O'Brien, he summed it up by calling the scenario in an awful way, the perfect media story.
And he was referring to that mix of sensational elements that guaranteed national coverage. You had the missing toddler, the suggestion of abduction, the bizarre Gothic detail of the severed pig's head.
And those initial unfounded rumors of satanic cultism that really captivated the public imagination.
It was a chaotic, emotionally charged narrative from the very beginning.
What's fascinating here is how the media coverage shifted its focus beyond the suspect and the facts of the crime to the victim's environment and family. It's almost as if they put the entire town of Mo on trial.
That is a crucial insight from the sources. Metropolitan journalists frequently frame the case not just as a singular murder, but as a symptom of much broader social decay and economic hardship specific to rural Australia.
They focused on the personalities and lifestyles of Jaidyn's parents and the community.
Heavily.
It seems like they used the tragedy to offer a broad cultural critique.
Absolutely. The journalist Andrew Rule famously articulated this framing. He wrote that the story was fundamentally about where the child came from, a place of broken families and broken hearts, shattered trust, and stunted dreams.
That's an attempt to pathologize the community itself.
It is, suggesting that such tragedies were the natural outcome of rural economic decline and poor social fabric.
And this characterization resulted in what was widely described as a trial by media for the residents of Mo.
The sources confirm the media characterization was brutal. They effectively painted Mo as a ghetto of the abandoned and unfairly demonized its residents, portraying them as uncivilized, uneducated bogans.
So the media attention, instead of just seeking justice, it focused on scrutinizing the perceived deviance of the local population.
That's right.
How did the community react to this onslaught of negative metropolitan coverage?
They fiercely resisted it. Mo residents voiced strong complaints that the metropolitan media had turned Jaidyn Leskie's disappearance into a circus. They felt completely dehumanized and judged.
They just wanted the focus to remain on finding the truth.
They publicly questioned the lack of basic sympathy or compassion shown by the big city press, arguing that the focus should have remained squarely on the search for truth and accountability, not on stereotyping their way of life.
So if the justice system failed to secure a conviction and the media offered this broad societal judgment, what was the ultimate concrete institutional response from the Victorian state government?
The government's eventual response was aimed precisely at addressing that media-driven narrative of poor parenting.
So in the absence of a convicted murderer, the state decided to address what they could legally influence.
Which was the behavior and decisions of parents regarding childcare.
And this culminated in the development of the babysitter's kit almost 10 years later.
Correct. The Victorian state government issued this single-page document almost a decade after the murder. It was presented as a guide offering common-sense advice on choosing a responsible babysitter.
And the phrasing and distribution, it seemed implicitly aimed at uneducated or low-income parents?
That's how it was perceived, yes.
What were the specifics of the advice it contained?
Well, it stressed that while Victorian law doesn't set a minimum age for babysitters, parents have a legal responsibility to choose someone mature and capable. It specifically advised parents to check that the sitter has experience looking after a child of a similar age, emphasizing that this is particularly important for babies.
So the underlying message was clear. Jaidyn's death was ultimately the result of a poor parental choice,
rather than the failure of the justice system to hold the perpetrator accountable.
The creation of that kit years after the fact, it feels like an institutional acknowledgement of the tragedy that simultaneously deflects accountability from the systemic failures in the investigation and the legal process.
That is the analytical crux of this response. It is the government providing an actionable solution to a political problem. By focusing on common sense advice for parents, they effectively shift the blame for the irresolution away from the systemic issues.
The initial investigative failure, the massive DNA contamination error, the legal constraints of double jeopardy.
And they place it back onto the victim's environment.
As we, synthesize the sources and step back from this decades-long case, it's just so clear that the investigation was hobbled from day one by this unique constellation of factors.
Absolutely. The sources reveal a scenario where a definitive resolution was virtually impossible. You had the intentional deception and shifting timelines from GD.
The devastating distraction of the totally unrelated vandalism.
The specific forensic catastrophe of the DNA contamination, and then the legal hurdle of double jeopardy that prevented any reconsideration, even with those strong coronial findings.
And despite the 2006 inquest's powerful declaration that GD contributed to the death and disposed of the body, the legal system remains stuck. The murder is still officially unsolved.
That finding is the closest we have to the truth, but it holds no legal power to overturn the acquittal. There has been no compelling new evidence presented since then, and the family and the community are just left in this persistent, painful state of irresolution.
So if we bring it back to that singular institutional response, the government's decision to issue a babysitter's kit almost a decade later, it really encapsulates the entire complexity of this case's aftermath.
It does. And it raises a profound question for us and for you, the listener, to consider. When a high-profile, devastating tragedy like this case achieves judicial failure, when the police can't prove it, the lab contaminates the evidence, and the law prevents a retrial, what is the appropriate societal or institutional response?
Right.
Is the focus on basic parenting advice in the absence of justice a satisfactory form of accountability? Or does it serve as an act of institutional deflection, protecting the system from having to confront its own significant failures? It requires us to critically examine what we truly seek when we demand justice, a verdict, or simply preventative measures against future tragedy. The Leskie case suggests we often receive the latter when the former is unattainable.